Hey everyone, we're just going to wait a couple minutes while folks join the room. Just give it one more minute, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. My name's Tom Walker. I'm the Executive Director at Encore Outpatient Services. We are a Caron Treatment Centers and Maryland Addiction Recovery Center partnership. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar series, DMV Neighbors in Treatment and Recovery, a spotlight on local resources, programs, and expertise. Every week, we highlight a different provider in the DMV region to provide you with insights and resources you can utilize in your practice. Please note that these sessions are not eligible for continuing education credit. We will be conducting these sessions in webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. We will provide time for Q&A during and after the presentation. This week, we welcome Laura Goldstein, who is a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist. Laura has been intensively trained in dialectical behavioral therapy through the Behavioral Tech Linehan Institute in 2015 and Gottman Level 1 certification in 2017. After working in both substance use and failure to launch IOPs, Laura is now the owner of Montgomery County Counseling Center in Rockville, Maryland. Their mission is to provide a collaborative, systems-based team for families to seek coordinated care for both individual therapy and family therapy. Please welcome Laura.
The introduction. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so grateful for y'all for having me. As you said, we'll be taking questions throughout, and I just want to put a shout out that I'd love to have questions throughout the discussion. Doing this on a webinar feels like I don't have as much of engagement and relationship with people, so I would love to pause a couple of times to ask questions. So don't be shy. If you have questions, please definitely send them in to Tom. That would be awesome. So today we're going to talk about the importance of validation and how to motivate parents to actually practice it. I think one of the things that we see so often as therapists working with teenagers and children and then trying to have their parents help alongside is that we need our parents to slow down and focus on the emotion before they focus on whatever type of problem solving that they are trying to push through. And so there are a couple of objectives that we're going to focus on today. Next slide, Caitlin, thanks, is why validation is such an important role in family therapy, and especially with teens who are struggling. And that includes teens who are struggling with substance use, self-harm, school refusal, intense anxiety, really any emotion, and even the normal ones of just disappointment, rejection, isolation, especially during COVID. Really any emotion needs validation. So we're going to talk about why it's so important. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I orient parents to do this work so that I can motivate them by understanding how important it is for their child, but also how important it is for them and what their goals are. We'll talk through the 3 most common thinking errors that parents have that often get in the way of validation to try to dismantle some of those thinking errors and provide some more helpful cognitive ways of looking at that. And then if there's time, we'll talk through the 6 levels of validation and how I teach parents how to do that. That'll be sort of depending on time today. But the goal is for parents to access their own vulnerability in order to sort of sit with their child in their vulnerability. Next slide. So in DBT, we talk about the biosocial theory being the explanation for why kids struggle with really intense emotions and then also with sort of maladaptive coping behaviors that go along with them. And the idea is that the biology and the environment work together to either make problems more intensified or for the solutions to try to heal the whole system. So the biology piece is that people are wired and born to be sensitive to emotions, more reactive to emotions, and slow return to baseline. I think one of the things that's extra challenging is that sounds like all teenagers. And so part of sort of the mental health world is trying to figure out how we can spot those people earlier on and figure out what's normal adolescent behavior that sounds like this versus what is really more of a biological predisposition to intense emotions. But that's why we tend to see a lot of this becoming problematic in adolescents, because on top of the biological piece they may have, they also are then dealing with all the developmental, hormonal, social things. So the biology piece is that. And then the environmental piece is how your environment responds to all of that sensitivity. So if your environment is dismissing your emotion or ignoring your emotion, you're going to want to make it more clear what you're feeling, which means you typically act louder in some type of way. And also the environment can reinforce your behaviors. So oftentimes parents accidentally reinforce the unskillful coping behaviors rather than reinforcing the skillful ones. And so in family therapy, we work on all that environmental piece. And today in particular, we're going to talk about the validation aspect. So how you can use the validation skills in order to help solve the biology. So that's ultimately what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. When I orient parents to the idea of invalidation, I often work with them through this cycle, which explains sort of what can go wrong when we're not practicing validation. To sort of summarize the cycle, what happens is a child or a teenager is upset about something that may or may not have to do with their parents. It could be unrelated regarding school or friendships. Maybe it's something that the parents did, who knows, but they communicate that emotion of being upset. And what usually comes with that is that they have some sort of confusion. There's a part of them that's like, oh yeah, I am upset. And then a part of them that's thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't be upset. Or maybe like, I don't have a reason to be upset. Or maybe I'm making too much of this. So they're sort of in a conflict with themselves about whether they should be feeling their emotion or not. When they express them being upset, they are not expressing their confusion about it. They're expressing just the part that's upset about it. And so what happens when kids express that is parents and caregivers want to help. We want to say something reassuring or helpful or problem solving. And what happens is the part of them that's confused is hearing, oh, so I shouldn't be feeling this. And then the other part of them that's like, but I am feeling this, is like, but I am. And so it makes the confusion worse when we dismiss the underlying emotion. And so what then happens, kind of like what I was saying before, is when someone feels dismissed, one of two things. They either get louder to be heard, because if you're not feeling heard, maybe I'll be heard if I'm a little louder, or they withdraw. So it is painful to feel dismissed. They don't want that feeling to continue on, so they sort of withdraw into their own. And that's really ultimately unhelpful for parents, because parents usually want to understand, they want to be able to help, but the more escalation that happens, the more confusing parents are. And then also if there's withdrawal, their parents also are confused. They're not getting any information of what's going on. So when that happens, parents feel frustrated. They don't know what they did wrong. They're thinking to themselves, all I tried to do was help. And here this reaction is happening. And in that frustration, the cycle continues. So they may say something that's even further dismissing or invalidating. And then the next part of it going around is now the child's upset about being dismissed, and we re-enter the cycle. So I show parents this this model. And if you're interested in using this PDF, you can find it on my website. But I talk with them through it and I pay attention to the areas where they relate. So when I see parents nodding along or interrupting and saying, oh yeah, this absolutely happens, they'll maybe give an example. It's a way for me to sort of assess what pieces of this they relate to and also gauge how willing they are to be vulnerable with me. So if I sense that they're really vulnerable and really agreeing, like, yeah, we need help with this, then it is a permission for me to sort of hold them more accountable earlier on. If I'm noticing that they're not getting really vulnerable, I'll stick a little bit more to the psychoeducation rather than the accountability and also the empathy. And I'll hold on to, it's really hard when your kid is acting like this and all you're trying to do is help. And so I'll sort of use their responses to this model to guide where we go from here. But ultimately, what we then talk about is in this cycle, it's the parent's responsibility to try to change this and do something different. If you can practice validation without dismissing your kid's emotions, you will wind up on a different path that will be more effective for everyone. Now, this cycle happens for both parent-child relationships, spouses, friends. This can happen between any two individuals. And if we're talking about two adults where this is happening, everyone is equally responsible to validate each other's emotions. But when we're talking about a parent-child relationship, it is developmentally appropriate for the parent to be leading by example. And that doesn't mean that the parent's emotions are invalid or that they don't need a space. It just means that in order to put this on a different track, parents need to go first. And I would say that that's true across the board with teenagers. I think that it is even more true with teenagers and children who have emotional and mental illness because they're not able to do this. This idea of validation is a skill. And if they struggle with skills to handle their emotions, we wouldn't be able to expect that they would be able to do this. So that's really like my first introduction to this concept for parents and why this is so important. And oftentimes parents will say, well, like, we want to get to what to do about it so that it doesn't happen again. Totally legitimate. But if you're spinning up into either escalation or withdrawal, you're not going to get there. So I pull the parents in to really talk about this being necessary to get to what is important for you, which is actually what do we do about it in a way where it's absorbable by your kid because they need to be able to hear it. And if they can't hear it because of this cycle, it's really wasted energy. And it's also damaging the relationship, which parents are generally invested in repairing. Tom, any questions yet so far?
Not yet.
Okay, that's totally fine. I'm just going to check in one or two more times just to be sure. All right, next slide. Oh, I realize I'm looking at my presentation notes. Here we go, next slide. So the other thing that I often talk through with parents, and I don't always load them all with this in one session because it's a lot of psychoeducation, and so I don't lay it on all at once. But I do teach them the wave theory. And so the idea behind the wave theory is that emotions are a wave. They come on, they rise, they reach a peak, which is usually the scariest part, and then they go away. And there's something really important about being able to go through that whole process because the going away part is what makes the peak feel less scary. When you get proof that your emotions come down on their own, then you know that you're not unsafe or in crisis when you're at the peak. But when you don't get that proof, the peak feels like it could last forever. And so there's a very important dynamic of your brain having the full experience. So kids generally have a desire to cut off this wave with some type of urge. This is often where substance use comes into the picture. It's also where self-harm, school refusal, often like lashing out at parents about something totally unrelated because they don't want to be in their own emotion wave. All those sort of maladaptive coping behaviors come in. And when a kid cuts off their emotion, they're preventing themselves from feeling the peak discomfort, which short term might be helpful, but long term is unhelpful because then they don't get the experience of that coming down. And so what kids ultimately need is to learn how to tolerate that whole wave. The way this plays into parent validation is that when parents are trying to make it better, they are participating in the cutting off. The desire to rationalize the situation or cheerlead someone through, or, well, at least it's not so bad because, or any of those types of emotions that, or any types of comments that try to distract from the very emotion that we're in, is participating in the cutoff instead of doing something different. And so if you imagine the second half of this picture not there, and all that there was is the first half of this picture, the emotion cuts off near the peak. Every time you try to have this conversation again, you're starting at the intense moment. So if you wind up taking a break and then you come back to it, you're starting at the elevated level rather than being able to address it from the sort of bottom of the emotion wave. So what I talk with parents about is it's your job to help them ride through this wave rather than cut it off. And it serves you because if you want to talk with them about it again, it's better off that you're getting them at the bottom of their emotion wave rather than at the top. And sometimes I use metaphors like climbing a mountain. It's much less scary to climb down a mountain if you're coming down gradually than if you're literally shooting off a cliff. And so when you cut off, you're basically shooting off a cliff. So I talk with parents through why it's so important to allow their kids to feel what they're feeling. And instead of trying to change the subject or move them into feeling something different, the goal of validation is to ride that wave with them. One of like the more common topics and themes that's out there right now is the idea of toxic positivity. And that comes into this exactly as we're talking about. I just wanted to throw that language out there because it's so well widely talked about right now. Toxic positivity, the idea of sort of like, it'll all be okay, plays into that. And this is sort of the dismissing piece of not really honoring the significance of whatever the emotional experience is, and instead just trying to make it better, which is kind of like trying to fast forward through the wave of like, okay, so you're in this wave, but like you'll be out of it soon. And there's just that sort of tension between honoring that it's there and also not wanting for it to be there, which is a bit of a mixed message. We're kind of like communicating to our kids that like their emotions make sense, but also they shouldn't be feeling this. And that's the very thing that we don't want to be doing. We want to be allowing them to feel it. You can feel this for as long as you need. The moment a kid feels like they can feel it as long as they need, they don't really need to anymore. It's kind of like a game of tug of rope. If you let go of the rope, they can let go of the rope too. But if they're hearing the idea that they shouldn't be feeling it, they're going to pull on the rope even harder. So when I talk with parents about their desire to cut off this wave by different ways of engaging their child, there are usually three different ways that this happens. And these are sort of like the three thinking errors that go into the way that parents do this. Next slide, Caitlin, please. So the first one is what I call the overly empathic reaction. Empathy is a good thing. So I don't want to say that empathic reactions are not a good thing, but too much empathy can sometimes get in your way. And I'm going to explain why that is. So for parents who are really overly empathic to their kids' emotions, they see their kid in an emotion wave and they recognize that their child is suffering, and they don't want that. No parent wants their child to suffer. So they respond in ways to try to prevent the suffering. Problem solving, positive encouragements, a lot of the examples that I was just describing. And that makes sense, right? The intention is 100% legitimate. Unfortunately, what the child hears is one of two different things. The first thing that the child hears is, all right, my parents can't really handle when I have emotions. I should probably have less of them so my emotions don't seep out. And then they tend to want to bottle up their emotions, and they may feel guilty when they inevitably wind up seeping out of the seams. So this idea of trying to make the emotion go away means that the kid is going to try to make their own emotions go away in the long term. And I think we all know that no kid who bottles their emotions, that it doesn't come out at some point in some way, it's usually less helpful down the road. So that's the first thing they hear. The second thing that they might hear is that that the parent doesn't think that the child can handle the situation. So they feel like, oh, my parents don't trust me to handle this. If they're giving me these problem solving suggestions, I must not know how to deal with it on my own. And usually one of two things happens with that thought from a child. Either I'll show them I do know how to handle it on my own, I'm going to do that, and they might make it worse. So basically they shut themselves off to the parent's advice, which is usually good advice, but because they're trying to sort of hold their own and show that they can be trusted, they could act impulsively. Or alternatively, they might start to believe in their minds, you're right, I can't do this on my own. I do need my parents to solve my problems for me, which over time develops a sense of over-reliance and dependence on parents. So kids will start relying on parents to solve all of their problems, which really is developmentally problematic because they need to learn how to handle not just their problems, but also their emotions on their own. And the period of time for teenagers is a transition from them doing it, parents doing it for them in childhood. In the teenage years of adolescence, it's parents teaching them how to do it for themselves. And then as they become young adults and then adults, it's the parents just being supported from the sidelines. And so it's important that in these teenage years, parents don't jump in with these problem solving ideas, but that they might instead brainstorm with their kid or talk through the pros and cons of different solutions, but not until you validate. So I'm getting a little bit distracted by myself. So we don't want kids to hear when problem solving is offered, we don't want kids to hear, yeah, you're right, I can't handle this on my own, because then they'll become dependent on their parents. So where's the sort of wisdom in here? Where's the solution? I think the most important thing is to help parents understand the difference between struggling and suffering. Struggling is a safe thing. Everyone struggles. If you had to think about the time where you learned the most important lesson in your life, it probably was associated with some type of struggle that you've had. And so it's okay to let your kids struggle. Just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's unsafe or intolerable. And the kid's allowed to experience that. And the kid can, the goal is to trust that they can handle that. That the parent doesn't have to take the kid out of their emotion. And so that looks like teaching them how to sit with it. Certainly if the child is in individual therapy on their own, they're going to be working on that with their therapist and learning distress tolerance skills to get through their emotion wave. And if they're not, and it's the parents who are doing this, things like, yeah, this really sucks. Like, I know it's temporary, but while we're here, it's really uncomfortable. Those are really helpful ways of sort of allowing this space for that struggle to exist. The piece about this I think is most difficult for parents is that it requires vulnerability. The parent has to expose themselves to the emotion a little bit also. In order to sit with a child in their emotion, you kind of have to sit with it yourself. For those of you who are familiar with Brene Brown, she has phenomenal resources and TED Talks on this very theme, and I often will show parents the 3-minute clip of her empathy versus sympathy. So sympathy is the kind of like looking down on someone like, oh yeah, it's really dark in there. And then the empathy is sitting with them in it like, oh wow, yeah, this is like really, really dark. And there's just a difference in the emotional vulnerability that comes with that. So parents need to be able to access that vulnerability to foster connection. And that's usually where, like I said before, the most pivotal growth happens. So I will, if I notice that this is something that parents are struggling with, we'll talk through this reaction or this chain of thinking errors and how we can look at some sort of more middle pathways of thinking about it, this wisdom of being able to endure struggling and suffering. And then in family therapy, a lot of parents will also say, well, like, how do I tell the difference? Which is a topic for another day, but I do think that it's our role as family therapists or teenage therapists who are just kind of consulting with the parents to help our parents understand really the difference, and sometimes even to help our kids understand the difference, because they don't always understand the difference either. But again, I digress. Tom, any questions? I noticed that I missed my last opportunity to ask for questions. So before I go on to the next one, I just wanted to pop in.
There's a couple questions.
Oh, awesome. Great. All right.
So one, and then the second piggybacks off it. So how young can a child be for validation to be effective?
0 age. talk to parents of like infants as they're like soothing their baby. It's okay to be scared. Yeah, that was a loud noise. That's totally okay. Like that loud noise was scary. And I think that that's part of this sort of societal pull, is that we try to distract from scary emotions even from infancy. When a kid is crying, it's like, look at this toy, it'll be okay. And that's, okay, there's no long-term emotional damage that's going to happen, but there would be a great practice for you as a parent to learn that it's okay that your baby is scared of a loud noise that they might have heard, and you can soothe them while also saying, yeah, that was scary. Like, oh, we'll get through this together. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I actually love it when parents are able to start practicing this from infancy, because it really sets up the idea that like no emotion is wrong or inappropriate, and you don't have to get out of it. And as soon as you have permission for that, it goes away. So I love that. Practice it immediately.
So the other part of that too was, can you offer comfort like hugs while a child is at the peak of the wave?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It depends on if your child is open to it. Some children will not at all want to be touched or interacted with, especially if the emotion is towards the parent. So a lot of this happens, especially with teenagers, when a teenager is upset with a parent. They are mad about a consequence, or they feel like their privacy is violated, or embarrassed that their parents said something to their friends that made them feel embarrassed, whatever it is. If the original emotion is directed towards the parent, kid may not want a hug. The kid may just want that sort of moment to be like, yeah, okay, you're allowed to feel what you're feeling. And in a couple of seconds, we're going to talk about that defensive response and how that's sort of the third thinking error in this cycle. But yeah, hugs are absolutely fine if the child wants it. I think part of what's validating is to honor what the child wants and not what you think they want. So if they're making it very clear, like, I don't want this, part of validating is honoring that truth for them and not forcing it upon them.
Thanks, Laura. Those are the questions for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I love answering questions. It makes me feel less of a like talking to myself situation. There's one other thing that I would just add about the first question about how young can you start this. I actually think that the younger you start this, the more prevention you get in not getting to the point where you have teenagers who are emotionally dysregulated. So if we think back to that biosocial theory, the environment and the biology work together to make things better or worse. And so without knowing what the biology, the mental health biology of your child is when they're young, if you're practicing validation, you're teaching them ways to manage their own biology. And ultimately what happens is that becomes their own voice in their head. So if they hear the voice in their head from a young age of like, it's okay that I feel this way, this was in fact upsetting, I hated that I wasn't invited to my friend's party, yeah, I'm allowed to be disappointed, then they're not going to be in that conflict with themselves that I was talking about earlier, which will prevent a lot of future problems. It's really that conflict with themselves about having emotions and thinking that they shouldn't, where further mental health issues, substance use issues, sort of maladaptive coping behaviors, that's where all that comes up. So if you're practicing the validation pieces right from the get-go of parenting, then you're going to prevent a lot of this stuff from happening in teenage years, because the child is going to be able to do that in their own head. That's going to be the tool that they've already learned because you've role modeled it for them. So I just wanted to add that piece in there. Okay, so we talked about the overly empathic reaction to sort of the desire to cut off the wave. The next one is the fearful reaction. This happens when a parent is afraid of what happens when their kid gets to the peak. Whereas a kid is afraid of what happens when they get to the peak just because it's uncomfortable, a parent can be afraid of what happens at peak because usually in the past something dangerous has happened. The peak is when they use, the peak is when they run away, the peak is when they threaten to kill themselves. And so it's 1,000% normal for parents to be scared of that. They don't want that. It has been traumatic in the past and they don't want it to be traumatic in the future. And their child's safety is the first and foremost important thing in their world. So it makes a ton of sense. That sort of like scared straight is legitimate. The thought that's associated with that emotion is Let's get them out of this wave as fast as possible so that we don't get to the dangerous behavior. And there's a little bit of a thought associated. This is usually very unconscious, but if we can do that, I'll also be less scared. So part of it is, let's get them out of it for their own benefit, which kind of is attached to the first piece that we just talked about, the overly empathic. But there's another piece of it too with the fear reaction, which is, if I can get them out of it and we're out of the danger zone, I'll feel better. I'll feel like we're okay. And so the way that this often presents in behaviors is rationalizing ways to see the situation differently. It's kind of like trying to, instead of look over here, look over here. Because if you're looking over here, maybe you won't be upset. And so similar to what I said before, you're trying to sort of fast forward through this so that it doesn't get dangerous. Again, two different ways that this usually is interpreted by a child. So the first thing that the child hears is, they're telling me I shouldn't be feeling this way. And if I shouldn't be feeling this way, there must be something wrong with me, because I am feeling this way and I shouldn't be feeling this way. So there's something wrong. And this is often where shame grows from. So shame is the feeling of not having done something wrong. That's guilt. Shame is, I am something wrong. And so if they are having emotions that they're being communicated through like subtle communication that they shouldn't be having, they wind up with a message of, I'm something wrong. Generally that leads to withdrawal. Generally that leads to other coping behaviors to help ease the shame, because now we're trying to soothe the wave of shame rather than soothe whatever the primary wave was in the first place. This is a really common cycle with self-harming teenagers. Shame is usually the prompting event for self-harm. So it's, if we can work our way through not having this happen in the first place, we can prevent a lot of the dangerous behaviors that parents are so afraid of. So that's the first sort of way that a child hears this. The second way that a child hears this, which I spoke a little bit about earlier, is like, my parents just don't get it. They don't get why I'm upset, and I'm gonna I need them to get it. I just need them to get it. And so if it's oozing out of my system, they'll get it. And I want to be really clear, it's not usually conscious and intentional. So a lot of the time we hear the word manipulation thrown out there. In DBT, we try not to use the word manipulation, because that presumes that a child is thinking through, if I do A, the result will be B. And that's just not the case. They're doing the best they can, but if they have biological predisposition to this and they don't have the skills, they don't have the tools to do the best they can that doesn't look like this. So I really like to take away the idea of manipulation, that it's not intentional and it's not conscious, and they're not escalating just to prove their point to you or just to make your life miserable. They're doing it because they don't have any other way. And when our internal need is to be heard, we do whatever we can to get that need met. And the reinforcement piece that I talked about a little bit through the biosocial theory can also feed into this, which again is sort of a divergence. But if it's worked in the past, if them escalating is when you finally listen to them, then they're going to keep escalating, which is a reason why if your kid says something really generally insignificant, like, oh, I don't know that I'm comfortable going to this appointment, take that seriously. Don't wait until you get to the appointment and they're having a temper tantrum in the room, because then you haven't heard them. Again, I'm sort of getting a little off topic. So that's what a child hears, either shame and withdrawal or anger at you for not getting it and escalation. So where do we sort of find the middle wisdom in this? The wisdom in this is that emotions are normal. You're not wrong for having them. You're not an alien for having emotions. And they can be safe when safe coping behaviors are used. And a big linchpin of that is that a teenager is using or learning to use safe coping behaviors. Hopefully, if you've had some of these more traumatic safety experiences, then your child, or the child that you're talking about as your client, is getting some of these skills on their own. And learning how to tolerate that wave without cutting it off is more effective than shutting the wave down, which is sort of the way I introduce the wave as a whole. And that goes for both kids and parents. So what I talk about with parents is, your kid's in a wave, they're trying to cut it off. You're also in your own wave of fear, and you're trying to cut it off. And while your kid might cut it off with substance use, the way you cut your wave off is by trying to control your kid. And if you can get your kid to do something different, then you'll feel better. And that's your version of cutting off. The only way that you can start to role model that different is for you to tolerate your own wave of fear. So experience the fear that you're having, stay with it at its peak, notice that your fear will go away, and allow yourself the vulnerability to stay in your emotion of fear without letting that fear turn into the way you're parenting your child. That one is sometimes a little hard. Parents often have questions about that. And so we'll talk through certain examples, especially when there are safety concerns. You know, if your child's in imminent danger and you need to call 911, don't sit there riding your wave out until you're feeling less scared. So we'll talk through sort of what that looks like in the moment. But the general philosophy is you've got to tolerate your own wave. And if you are able to do that, your kid will learn to tolerate theirs. And the vulnerability, again, that just means acknowledging that you have fear, acknowledging that you also have an emotion. One of the things that's so important in this is that you're also communicating to your kid that trying to control others isn't the way to cope with your emotions. So if you're trying to change your kid and what they're doing in order for you to feel better, they might then try, again, not conscious, but just through behavioral learning, they might learn that controlling other people around them is the way to tolerate their emotions, which means they will always be seeking external sort of targets to feel better rather than internal resilience. And that's the very thing we don't want to teach. So again, I'm sort of framing this for parents as the long-term goals in addition to the short-term goals. All right, the last of the three thinking errors in this that I talk about. Any questions?
One question about how you change the pattern. So if you've been doing this and you have a teenager, you've been stopping the wave, and now you're in the process of changing that, what's the messaging to your child as you're trying to change that?
Yeah, so that's the how to do the validation, which if we have time and knowing that that's a question, I'll try to make time for it, I'll get to. In fact, if there are no other questions right now, let me get through this next piece so that I can try to get to the how to. All right, so the last of the third sort of errors in the way that this situation unfolds. This is, I find, to be the hardest one to talk about and the most vulnerable one to talk about. And this is the defensive reaction. This is where parents don't want to look at their role in a dynamic, especially when the emotions started from something that a parent might have done unskillfully. And let's face it, even adults are unskillful. We are all flawed human beings, and we are still worthy of love. I think I said that later on, so I'm giving you the headline up front. It's really hard for parents to sit with that. A lot of times the thinking is, if I focus on that or admit it, my kid's going to cling to that and not take accountability for their own actions. So I don't want to draw attention to what I've done wrong because I want them to be thinking about what they've done wrong. And the only way for them to learn is for them to pay attention to what they've done wrong. If they're focusing on me, then they're not going to learn. And so that comes up with a lot of defensiveness or deflection of redirecting the conversation to whatever it is that the child's done wrong or feels wrong, or whatever the accountability is for the child, rather than the empathy for the 5% of what their child might be feeling that might make sense, because the parent is inevitably imperfect and it's really hard to pay attention to that 5% of imperfection. So when this happens, again, two things that happen for a child in their internal monologue. The first thing is that perfection becomes the standard. My parents expect perfection of me. They expect perfection of themselves. They think they're imperfect. They want me to be, they think they are perfect. They want me to be perfect too. And that's the only way for us to survive in this family, is if we're all perfect and feeling good all the time and handling our emotions absolutely perfectly all the time. And then, but wait a second, I've got a lot of feelings and I have a lot of imperfect behaviors. So I don't know that I can meet those standards. And if I can't meet those standards, how do I fit into this family? How do I survive if I can't do this perfection thing? And again, this leads to shame and low self-esteem and feeling like they're not meeting the expectations of what their parents are wanting for them. So when defensiveness happens from parents, the outcome that you're expressing is that perfectionism is the standard. The second thing that happens is that kids will feel really unfair and unjust, that the finger's pointed at them, that they're the scapegoat, that they have to do all this work in improving themselves and be in therapy and all of this accountability without other people doing the same thing. And why is it that they have to carry this burden without other people taking a look at what they could have been doing better or where they may have made errors? And when that happens, there's usually a lot of resentment. And their willingness to do their own work usually plummets. So if they feel like they have to work harder than everyone else, even though everyone else is a part of the cycle, they become really unwilling to do their own work. And as we all therapists know, willingness is like the number one thing necessary for change to actually happen. So one of the ways that I talk with parents about this is I actually talk about it from the willingness. I know you want your kid to change, and they need to change to be safe and to like make your family function better. The only way they're going to stay willing to change is if you stay willing to change. So you've got to take the lead on showing that you're willing to look at yourself so that they don't shut off their ability to see looking at themselves. And again, all the stuff that I've talked about up until now, I use to gauge how open a parent will or won't be to this conversation. There are some parents who getting to this part takes months. My goal is to have it not take that long, but it really depends on the vulnerability of the family that I'm working with. The wisdom here and what I try to work with parents around is the idea that nobody's perfect, kind of like what I said before. We are all flawed humans. We are all still worthy of love and support and affection and care. And so if you can hold yourself within that framework that you are imperfect and still lovable, then your kid will be able to start to hold themselves in that framework, that they're imperfect and still lovable. Being able to do that, where being imperfect isn't a problem, but in fact, like welcomed and regarded, means that you can begin to have more self-awareness of what those flaws are, because it's safe, because it doesn't mean something bad about who you are as a person, because the flaws and the intense emotions are not equated to being wrong, imperfect, not meeting the standard of the household. One of the ways that I talk with parents about how to actually communicate that is to focus not on the intention that they had when they said whatever they said or did whatever they did, and instead on the impact. So as humans, we all are defensive. We don't want the other person to see us as a bad person. So we have a tendency to defend our intentions. I didn't mean this, or what I was really trying to do was this, or I did this because X, Y, or Z. And so what we're really doing is we're saying, I meant well, I meant well, I meant well. But what we miss is it still hurt. It still hurt. It still hurt. And so to be able to be vulnerable in this moment means taking a one down approach, that you're putting aside your own emotions for a moment and looking at your kids' emotions and speaking to those, that, hey, this might not have been my intention, and I can see that it really hurt. A lot of times with behavioral modification, it's like kids are upset that, they had this consequence. And instead of telling them why they had this consequence or what they needed to do differently, so convincing them that they deserve the consequence, instead it's like, yeah, it totally sucks that you're not able to go out. I feel you. If I were a teenager and I wasn't allowed to go out with my friends tonight, I would also be bummed. So I totally get that you're bummed. You can be mad at me for as long as you need to be mad at me. Let me know when you want to talk about it again. So again, it's really that giving the permission to be in the emotion rather than trying to defend why you did what you did. I guess the last piece, maybe this is beating a dead horse, but I think part of the goal that I work on with families is to already assume that the intention is earnest. If we can hold on to the idea, and this is one of those core beliefs in DBT, that people are always doing the best they can, and in the very same moment, they can do better, try harder, improve what they're doing, then that's where sort of that balance between empathy and accountability lies, both for yourself and for other people in your family. And so if that assumption is already the groundwork, then you can assume that the intentions are earnest, and you can assume that you know that your intentions were good, so you don't have to convince yourself of it. And you can also assume that your kids' intentions were earnest, and you don't have to hear from them about that And so holding on to that dialectic is one of the things that we also work with really early on in DBT, especially in family work, so that working with assumptions about the intention doesn't distract from actually improving the behavior and the skills that are needed. So let's talk through really fast, because I have until 1 o'clock. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna sort of talk through the 6 levels of validation. Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna talk through them kind of quickly. I am more than happy to give more information on any of these, either privately. We also lead a parent support group. So if there are any parents who are watching this and you want more of this, actually, this is the lesson that we're teaching tonight. So if you want in on our parent support group that's tonight, we're going to dig into each of these 6 levels much more. And we run this parent support group every season. So if tonight's not the right night, we're offering the full 8-week cycle again in October. So just a little plug for that. It's 8 weeks. We talk about a lot of what I've just thrown at you, just in a whole lot more detail. So level 1 of validation is paying attention, communicating through your body language that you care about your child's experience, making that show through your facial expression as well. So if they're talking about something that's disappointing, it shows on your face. I think one of the biggest errors is when a kid notices, like when a kid comes to the realization of something that you've been wanting them to get to, you've got a smile on your face, because like, oh, they finally got it. But they're in some type of pain of having realized something that's painful. So you want to make sure that you're not thinking about your own thoughts about what they're saying and that that's coming out on your face, but instead with them in their emotion, that that's what's coming out on your face. So that's level 1. Level 2 is reflecting back. I make jokes a lot that this is the step that you see in the TV, like on TV and movies, when it's like the therapist is giving you an exercise. What I hear you saying is blah, blah, blah. It is true, and it often feels a little bit robotic or fake it till you make it, because it doesn't always feel 100% authentic, but it's really important. When you summarize your kids' expressions, what you do is you hold a mirror to them. And because kids are often confused about their own emotions, when you hold that mirror and you say, here's what I'm hearing for you, you allow them to sort through their own confusion. Because when they hear back exactly what they said to you, not adjusted, not challenged, just exactly what they said, they hear it back and they have the opportunity to think, no, it's actually not quite that that's the issue. Or like, yep, that's exactly the issue. So the idea of reflecting back isn't just so that your kid knows that you heard them, which is important, definitely. It's also because you allow them the moment to hear it back themselves and give some revision. So one of the things that is really important with reflecting back with this level 2, and also this applies to level 3 as well, is that the goal isn't to challenge what you've heard, which means that your tone of voice, has to come from a place of curiosity and not a place of questioning. So a neutral slate. It sounds like what you're saying is this. Am I getting it right? Not, oh, so you mean this is what you mean? And the difference in the tone from curiosity to challenge is really where the validation happens in this, because curiosity is inviting in whatever it is, and challenging is kind of that cutting off the wave, saying, I want it to be a certain thing, or it should be a certain thing, or I want you to see this a particular way. So that tone makes all the difference in what happens at that sort of wave cutoff. Oftentimes parents ask, well, what if I don't know what to reflect back? Like, what if it's just too confusing? Ask, hey, I'm not really sure what part of this is most important. It sounds like a lot of this is upsetting, but like, what's the most important part that's the most upsetting? And then once you get it, reflect that back too. Don't stop the reflecting back until you totally get it. Level 3 is making an inference about an emotion that might be unsaid. I kind of like to talk about this as like extending their reflection, or extending your reflection to the emotion. So oftentimes kids will talk a lot about the situation, but they won't actually say, I feel blank. Your goal is to try to hunt it out like an investigator. So figure out what it is that they might be feeling and show that you are seeking that out. So It seems like you're really angry about not getting an invitation to your friend's birthday party, but I wonder if you're feeling really hurt, or like, could it be that you're like, it seems like you're also just really confused about why it didn't happen, or that you're feeling excluded. And they might have just been saying angry, 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 but the minute that you put in there, like, you might also be feeling this, or you might also be feeling that, you give them permission to have all those confusing emotions, which is really what they need. Just like before, it's okay if you're wrong. The goal in this step isn't to guess correctly. The goal is just to give your kids some other options of what they could be feeling to help them make sense of their own emotions. So a lot of times when this happens and the parents hear back something like, no, that's not it. Okay, like, no, you're not attached to the outcome of being right, or at least the goal is to not be. You're just attached to the outcome of staying with your kid in their emotion rather than changing the subject. So all of these steps, where what we've already talked about and also where we're going, the goal is all to stay with the emotion rather than distracting. And what that means is everything going on in your head has to have the back seat until you've gotten through all of these steps. So let's keep going. And we'll talk about the last three, with the hopes of leaving time for some questions too. So level 4 is connecting how they're feeling now to something about their past experience, which probably makes the emotion make sense, right? Everything that we feel makes sense in the context of what we felt in the past. We're vulnerable to something because of what's happened in our past. So if you're looking for what your child is feeling or thinking and how it makes sense given what you know about them, you'll be able to communicate that in a way that's really powerful, because the more you know about them, the more you're able to make it make sense. And you're their parent, that means you know a lot about them. You're basically pulling on your connection in your relationship. And like, we have this deep, meaningful, long relationship. So I completely know and understand why this is so upsetting to you, is basically what you're saying. So the examples that I use for that almost always include the phrase, it makes sense. So one example, which is not the deepest, might be, I know how much you were looking forward to this party, so it makes sense that, we're going to be out, that you're disappointed that we're going to be out of town. Kid is saying, oh, we can't go out of town, I have this party, and they're screaming at you because, they don't want to go out of town. Hey, I know how much you were looking forward to it. It makes so much sense that that you're not allowed to go, or that we're out of town. The example that I had is not being allowed to go, but whatever it is, it makes sense. Another version of it cobe like, especially if it's in the child to parent dynamic, hey, it makes sense that you're bummed about being grounded. You're allowed to be bummed about being grounded. That makes sense. Level 4 and level 5 kind of go hand in hand. Level 5 is pulling from past experiences. Sorry, did I say that right? Level 4 is pulling from past experiences. Level 5 is pulling from the present. So level 5 often sounds like, yeah, I think if anyone were in your shoes, they'd feel the same way. So it's not based on them, but just based on the situation that the emotion is valid. So I was sort of alluding to this before, to say something along the lines of like, yeah, like, I didn't like being grounded when I was a teenager either, so I totally get that you don't like being grounded. That's sort of a combination of level 4 and level 5. But what you're really doing here is you're looking for how the real events make sense for the emotion. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with things that aren't true. It just means you have to look at what is real in their experience. If they are having this interpretation of a situation, whether or not their interpretation is accurate or not, their interpretation is real, and therefore their emotion is real. So a lot of times I'll say things like, yeah, I don't know that I totally agree with the way you're seeing it, but I think if that's what I thought was happening, I would also be really upset. And that's a way to sort of not agree or buy into some type of cognitive distortion, but still validate the emotion. A big one that I teach with parents is the difference between and but. So I get that you're feeling this, but you're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z. Or I get that you're feeling this, but that's not what happened. All the but does is it erases everything from the beginning of the sentence. So to say the word and just allows for both to be true. I totally understand where you're coming from. It makes sense that you're feeling this. And I also don't know, and I'm not going to take away your consequence. Or, and I see the situation differently. Any type of and comment you can make is much more helpful to acknowledge the present, which is the present is their emotion. And then the last bit, level 6, is really all that Brene Brown stuff of the difference between empathy and sympathy, which means being vulnerable. The more vulnerable you are, the more you expose yourself to being in the emotion with your child, the more genuine and authentic it feels. Certainly that sort of cheesy reflecting back thing that people don't like happens usually when it's not vulnerable and when it feels like it's not it's lip service. So level 6 is getting yourself to that level where it's not lip service. You're sharing in the feeling rather than convincing them to feel differently. And I think a big part of what is tough about this is parents don't want to feel bad. They don't want their kids to be feeling bad. They don't want to feel bad. And so I often tell parents, you just have to stay there for a temporary moment. You don't have to be sucked into their emotional roller coaster and stay on it. You just have to be on it long enough to communicate to your kid that you understand that it sucks that they're on it. A lot of what goes into this is not sort of one-upping or one-downing. So phrases like, well, how do you think I feel about this? Or, well, welcome to my world. Or, you think you had a bad day? Let me tell you about mine. Parents will ask a lot about storytelling and if they can tell a story of a time that they felt similarly. And I will often say, if you're telling the story in order to communicate, I felt the same way you felt, and so it makes sense that you feel that way. If that's the intention, stories can be great. If the story is to minimize and say like, well, this is what happened to me, so therefore what happened to you isn't quite so bad. Or if the story is, here's how I got through it, why don't you try this? Those are ways in which storytelling is unhelpful because the intention is to get through the wave rather than to just be in it. And like I said, the goal is to just be in it. So for the sake of trying to get through questions, I could talk a little more about this, but I'll wrap up and I'll see if there are any other questions from Tom about everything that I have talked about. And hopefully you'll check out some of our resources online. I'm on Instagram. You can sign up for my mailing list. I have a lot of blogs going out about this stuff all the time. So if you sign up, if you go to our website, you can sign up for our mailing list. Technology is not my thing, but it all works. So Tom, what other questions did you get for the last 3 minutes that we have?
So just really quick, the questions are really about the content, how to access it. Some folks have asked questions about getting the recording of this. It will be posted on Caron's YouTube channel within 24 hours. That's youtube.com/Caron Treatment. And a direct link will be circulated to everyone that's attended here. The other question was about your parent support group tonight and how would someone join that?
Shoot me an email right there, lauragoldsteinmft@gmail.com. The parent support group tonight is basically those 6 levels of validation that I just sped through in like 10 minutes. It'll be an hour and a half of digging into those. So you've already got a head start on it, but if you want to sign up, it's I think it's $60 for an hour and a half tonight, 6:30 to 8 p.m. And like I said, it's part of an 8-week workshop. So you're kind of coming in a little bit late, but that's okay because you just got a whole lot of what you would have gotten already. So you've got the skimming of the surface. If you want more details on the whole workshop, again, you can find that on the website. We are running it again starting the beginning of October if you want the full thing. But if you want in tonight, just shoot me an email.
And for kind of the last minute or two here, just to continue on with that, you want to highlight what you are doing in your practice and kind of the total?
Sure. So a lot of what you heard about is what we do in our practice, sort of the underlying philosophy of the work we do. My associates who work with teenagers and kids and young adults work more with helping them get the tools to ride their wave themselves and then be able to talk about it with their parents so that their parents can understand within appropriate realms of privacy. And then we also have associates who do the family work, parent coaching, some couples counseling that also helps sort of from the environmental end. And so what we love and what happens pretty often is we'll have one member of the family, whether it's the child or a parent, working with an individual therapist in our practice, and then the whole family working with a family therapist in our practice. Or the parents are working with a parent coach and one of the parents is in individual therapy and one of the siblings is with one therapist. You get the point. So that's really the model that we love. I came from an IOP background, and so have all of my associates on my team right now. So we're used to working as a team and having that sort of interconnectedness of care. And we're just trying to do that at the outpatient level. So yeah, that's our mission and our values. And I'm really excited that has sort of come together in a way that we can provide that care, because that model is so important to us. Even if someone's not within our own sort of umbrella of services at Montgomery County Counseling Center, we still want to collaborate with other therapists. So if I'm doing family therapy and you're the individual therapist, I want to be collaborating with you as often as necessary to provide good clinical care, because really the foundation of all that is just good clinical care, much more important than like keeping it all in one umbrella. So yeah, so that's what our practice does. Do I have time to like highlight a couple more things, or we're done?
We are just at that wrap up point. Do you want to make it quick?
Last pitch is that we're running a support group for college students who are struggling with this whole COVID situation. They're going to be living at home or possibly not. And so we do have a support group that we're running for college students that will be starting next month. So again, all that information is on the website, but that's the one sort of like rah that I'm really excited about.
Laura, thanks so much for your time today and for presenting. And I think the team approach to your practice is something that is so important and really cool. So thank you for that as well, for creating.
Much for asking me.
Yeah. Everyone else, I appreciate you joining. Thank you. Please join us next week, same day and time, as we welcome Denise Tordella, who will speak on the topic of women in addiction, trauma-informed gender-responsive treatment. Registration is now open for that webinar, so keep an eye out in your email for details on that. In the meantime, should you need anything, please feel free to reach out to myself here at Encore, to Mallory Schwartzman at Maryland Addiction Recovery Center, Jess Ayer, who represents Caron Treatment Centers in the state of Maryland, and James Fletcher, who represents Caron Treatment Centers in Washington, D.C. and the state of Virginia. Thanks again, everybody. You have a wonderful rest of your day.